La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Okay, so it's pure, beneficial. The person is authorized to conduct the transaction. It can be received or given, and also it is known to both parties. So you have to pay a little bit of attention to what you're buying, basically, and know what you're buying. Buying it without any knowledge, that is not permissible. So that is those are the conditions for two of the integrals, or the first one of the integrals. And then he mentions La ilaha illallah, a couple of questions that just stem from that. And then we wanted to mention some of the conditions of first, those conducting the sale. So the conditions of the buyer and the seller, we will just mention 3 of them. And those are conditions for the second, or you could say the third and fourth integrals, the buyer and the seller. And the first is that he or she be authorized by the sacred law to conduct transactions. It's called itlaq at-tasarruf in Arabic. That the person be authorized to conduct transactions. So what that means is they're not a child, that they've reached puberty, and they are of sound mind, and that they're not prohibited from transactions due to their wealth being impounded or some other reason. So like a little child who's certainly a child who's not discerning, but technically even a child who hasn't reached puberty technically can't conduct transactions, because until they reach puberty, their wali, their guardian, is supposed to oversee their property and conduct transactions for them in their best interests. Though since the time of the Salaf and also the Khalaf, the ulama of Islam have excused transactions of children in things that are not particularly significant. But large transactions, they shouldn't conduct it on their own, but rather their guardian should conduct it for them. And also their guardian, as we'll study a chapter later related to those that are not allowed to do transactions, their guardian is supposed to oversee their wealth and conduct transactions for them in a manner that is in their best interest. And even the guardian themselves is expected to conduct their transactions in the manner that is within their best interest. And one of the things you'll see is that that us and our property aren't really ours; they belong to Allah. So we can't just do anything we want with our property. And similarly, if someone is placed in our care and we're overseeing their property, we have to do so in a manner that's governed by the sacred law. It's not a haphazard matter. La ilaha illallah. So that was the first. The second is that they not be forced. So you can't if you force someone unwillingly to sell it, that's not permissible unless they're being forced rightfully. So in the case of someone who's in debt, a judge or the ruler, the governor can force them to sell some of their property in order to pay their creditors. But if the person is forced unjustly, then it's an invalid transaction. And then the last condition is that you can't sell, for instance, the Arabic of Quran to an unbeliever. So like that in hadith books, in the Shafi'i school, you can't sell them the Arabic of the revelation. And that's for obvious reasons, that for its sanctity. Some imams differ, but there's no reason for them to have the Arabic of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's revelation, which we'll discuss a little bit in the topic of his speech, the attribute of speech, in the Monday night class. But the translation of the meaning, it would be more religiously cautious and also showing more reverence to Allah's words, subhanahu, not to sell them the Arabic text of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's revelation. And in the Shafi'i school, it doesn't enter into their ownership. La ilaha illallah. But it's probably not a good deal to try to grab it out of their hands or something. And that happened one time. some reporters once came to, could you pause it for a second? Some offensive to sell a Quran to a Muslim, because it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's word. And it's offensive to buy it as well, or they differ about that, but it's offensive to sell the Quran. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So those are conditions of the person conducting the sale. So you can't buy something from a crazy person. And if it's of significant value, you shouldn't buy it from an underage child. You should buy it from someone who's reached puberty, because again, then they're authorized to conduct transactions. And obviously you can't force someone to sell you their property, though a governor or a judge in certain circumstances can force someone to sell their property. And for non-Muslims, we should give them translations of the meaning of the Quran, but not the Arabic text itself. And that is more becoming of its sanctity. Now, and there's a few other points, but we won't go into those. La ilaha illallah. So that is the second of the pillars, if we say them as three. And then what about the agreement, the offer and acceptance? And the offer and acceptance, as Imam Shafi understood it technically, are a spoken offer and acceptance, like we would do in a marriage agreement. So, for instance, if we were to conduct a marriage, the person who's dictating it to them would have the wali offer the girl's hand to the groom, and he would accept. So he might say, "I'll marry you." So and he'll say, "I'll marry you, my daughter Ruqayya," and he would say, "I'll accept for the aforementioned dowry." Technically, that's how sales and rentals and other types of transactions are to take place. That there's a spoken offer and acceptance. And that was an ijtihad of Imam Shafi that he understood from the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, which is in Ibn Majah, إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ عَنْ تَرَاضٍ, that selling or buying is only due to mutual satisfaction. And that people's being mutually satisfied, you don't understand that unless they've stated as such. So for that reason, he understood that it had to be stated. And it could also be written, but actually writing it is less of an emphatic expression than it's actually being stated. And that's the view of the Shafis. And it's a little bit tough because typically people don't state. And fortunately, they say that if there's an exchange that indicates that satisfaction, like you say, "How much does that cost?" and he says $5, and you give him the $5 and he gives you that thing, that suffices. And it's called mu'ata, just by a mere exchange of hands. And that is permissible based on a difference of opinion. But technically, it was actually a spoken offer and acceptance. And writing with an intention counts as that. La ilaha illallah. So then the conditions of that is La ilaha illallah. We're not going to go into those conditions just because of the detail of them. But some seekers will expect them to know that. But anyway, that is the spoken offer and acceptance. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah Allahumma salli wa sallim alayhi wa ala alihi. Let's see if there are any more details here. No. Anyway, so basically, you'll see that all of us are adults, alhamdulillah, or most of us are, some of us are young adults or almost adults. So once someone's mature and they're authorized to conduct transactions, as long as they know what they're purchasing and the person knows what they're receiving, in like the transactions that we engage in stores and what have you, it'll be valid. So you see a can of peas on the shelf, and on it is written the contents such that you understand what's inside it, and the price is printed clearly on it, and the checker that you conduct the transaction with is aware of what they have just run through the little barcode machine, and it comes up and shows them what it is. So you're aware what exists is that it's pure and it's a benefit, and both parties are present and both parties know what's being transacted, then you're fine. And then we said something that is described but not present. We'll cover that in more detail in upcoming classes, and that's like catalog transactions and so forth, and we might have to actually go outside of the Shafi school a little bit there. But you're straight in regards to that. And then there's just some concerns that relate similarly to the adab of conducting transactions and general adab of Islam. So for instance, there's an invocation for the market. And the Prophet ﷺ actually taught an invocation for going into a market. And he said that if there's none of you who enters the market and says, La ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah, lahul mulk wa lahul hamd, yuhyi wa yumit, wa huwa hayyun la yamut, biyadihi al-khayru, wa huwa ala kulli shayin qadir. That means, La ilaha illallah, wahdahu la sharika lah, there is no God save Allah, alone without partner. Yuhyi wa yumit, He gives life and He gives death. Wa huwa hayyun la yamut, and He is living, He never dies. Biyadihi al-khayr, all good is in His hands. Wa huwa ala kulli shayin qadir, and He has power over all things. No one from you who enters a market and says this, except that Allah writes for him 1,000. Allah writes 1 million good deeds and effaces 1 million evil deeds and raises him or her in 1 million levels. And that's the dhikr of the souk. That's related by At-Tirmidhi and Hakim and others. And the least you can say for its chain of transmission is that it's hasan, that it's well authenticated. But that's what Al-Shawkani said, though others, like Al-Hakim, said that it was sahih. So for instance, if we enter the supermarket or what happens, that he or she be authorized by the sacred law to conduct transactions. It's called itlaq at-tasarruf in Arabic. That the person be authorized to conduct transactions. So what that means is, when he mentions La ilaha illallah, a couple of questions that just stem from that, and then we wanted to mention some of the conditions of the La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Okay, so it's pure, beneficial. The person is authorized to conduct the transaction. It can be received or given, and also it is known to both parties. So you have to pay a little bit of attention to what you're buying, basically, and know what you're buying. Buying it without any knowledge, that is not permissible. So those are the conditions for 2 of the integrals, or the first 1 of the integrals. And then first, those conducting the sale. So the conditions of the buyer and the seller, we will just mention 3 of them. And those are conditions for the second, or you could say the third and fourth integrals, the buyer and the seller. And the first is